The Black Forest had a name in every language that mattered, and every one of those names meant the same thing: stay out. In Orcish it was Grakfal, the place where the dark breathes. In Elvish it was Sithamaran, the hollow that swallows. The dwarves called it Coldrath, which translated roughly as the thing we do not translate further. Even the humans who had settled the lowlands 3 generations back and built their timber towns and claybrick markets along the river Esavel, even they had their word for it. They called it simply the Black, and they said it the way you say a name you don't want to speak twice in one breath. My name is Davin Kress. I was a scout for the Esavel River Compact, a fancy title for a job that mostly involved counting merchant wagons and noting whether the northern passes were icy. I was 26 years old, recently demoted from field corporal to field nothing following an incident involving a commanding officer, a forged supply manifest, and my sincere belief that the commanding officer was stealing from the refugee rations. I was right about that, incidentally. Being right had not improved my situation. So when the compact needed someone to cross the eastern ridgeline and map the Black Forest's outer edge, not enter it, they were very specific about the not entering part. They assigned Davin Kress. The message was clear without anyone having to say it out loud. They did not expect me back. The assignment was the sort of thing that happens when an institution wants to be rid of you, but can't quite bring itself to dismiss you properly, so it sends you somewhere dangerous and calls it duty. I didn't argue. I took my pack, my compass, a week's rations, and my old ranger's blade, a short, heavy thing my mother had given me, plain as a fence post, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, and I walked east. The forest changed before you reached it. That was the thing nobody who'd never gone close to the Black could tell you. It wasn't like walking toward a tree line. It was like walking toward weather. A mile out, the air got colder and the birdsong thinned, the way birdsong thins when a hawk is circling overhead. Half a mile out, the color drained from the undergrowth. Not dramatically, nothing dramatic about it actually. The green just became a quieter shade of green, and then a grayer shade, and then you looked around and realized every shadow was pointing inward, toward it. The Orcs had a settlement 6 miles north of the forest's edge. I'd passed within 2 miles of it on the way. You could smell the cookfires when the wind was right, the specific char of Orcish hearthwood. They burn a denser timber, something I've never identified, and it smells like cedar mixed with something mineral, almost metallic. I'd kept my distance. Orcs and human compact scouts were not at war technically, but we were not at peace in any way that meant anything either. There was an armistice. There was a 2-mile buffer zone, marked with stones and treaties. There was the sort of peace that exists when 2 people in a room agree not to speak to each other. I'd reached the outer edge of the Black by late afternoon on my second day out. I set up a small camp in a clearing about 40 yards from the tree line, made a fire I kept deliberately small, ate half a ration bar, and took out my surveying tools: compass, sketchbook, the compact's standard measurement string, knotted at regular intervals. I started walking the perimeter, making notes: distance to the nearest landmark, the density of the outer canopy. The way the trees at the edge were different from the trees behind them. The outer ones leaned outward, I noticed, which seemed significant. Even the trees were trying to get away from what was inside. I worked for 4 hours. The shadows stretched long and purple and the temperature dropped sharply. I went back to my camp, rebuilt the fire, and slept badly. In the morning I broke camp, ate the second half of the ration bar, and walked another section of the perimeter, moving south. By midday I had covered what I estimated to be 2 miles of tree line. By my count, I needed another 4 or 5 before I'd have enough to construct a reasonable outer edge map. The kind of thing the compact's cartographers could use. The kind of thing that would justify the assignment even if nobody had actually expected me to complete it. I was measuring the distance between 2 distinctive marker trees. One had a split trunk, lightning damage probably, the 2 halves grown back parallel like a pair of raised arms, when I heard the sound. It was laughter. I stopped. I stood very still. The The way I'd learned to stand still when my commanding officer reviewed my work, and I needed him to think I wasn't the person who had crossed out the false supply numbers and written the real ones in the margin. The laughter came again. It was light, bright, the specific frequency of something genuinely delighted by something else. Not hysterical, not mocking, just the clean, effortless laugh of someone who has found a thing amusing and has not yet learned to hide that finding. It was coming from inside the Black Forest. I am not an impulsive person. I want to state that clearly because what I did next seems impulsive, and I'd like the record to reflect that I spent approximately 4 seconds weighing my options before I made my decision. The sound was small. The laughter was too light to belong to anything large. And I had spent 2 days walking the perimeter of the most feared stretch of woodland in the Northern Territories, being extremely careful and very respectful of all the warnings. And what I had found was a cold clearing and some inward-leaning trees. I walked into the Black Forest. The change was immediate, not threatening. That was the surprise. It was like stepping into a chapel. The light thinned and went green-gray, filtered through a canopy so dense it moved in visible layers above me. The undergrowth was different in here. Darker moss, thicker, more cushioned underfoot than anything I'd walked on in 2 days of marching. The silence wasn't silence exactly. It was the absence of human register noise. No wind at the crown level. No insects of the kind I was used to hearing. But there were sounds, deep, subsonic ones, not quite felt through the ears, more felt through the soles of your feet, as if the ground itself was making slow, tidal decisions about something. The laughter had stopped. I waited. Then it came again, closer. 30 yards, maybe less. Off to my left, where the trees grew in a rough circle around a space that might have been natural or might have been cleared, I couldn't tell which. I moved toward it the way I'd been trained to move toward things I couldn't identify. Slowly, weight forward, feet placed before they took my weight. No sound from my pack because I'd cinched it down. I rounded a tree with a trunk as wide as a wagon wheel and stopped. The thing sitting in the center of the clearing was small. That was the first thing I registered. Small and cross-legged, and apparently engaged in a private competition with a pinecone. She was rolling it between her palms, small palms, scaled in a pale iridescent green, and then tossing it into the air and catching it, and each time she caught it she made a small sound of satisfaction. She was perhaps the size of a human child of 4 or 5, though everything about her was wrong for a human child. The ear structure, long and ridged, folding at the top into a delicate point. The eyes, which when she looked up at me were a vivid citrine yellow with vertical pupils. The tail, which was thin and whip-like, and currently coiled loosely around her ankle the way a cat's tail moves when the cat is calm. She was a Velhari. I knew the word from briefing papers. The Compact's military intelligence kept files on every species in the region, even species they'd never encountered directly. The Velhari were documented, but almost completely undocumented in practice. They were listed as an arboreal civilization with claims to large stretches of the Eastern Territories. Their societal structure was described as complex and hierarchical, likely matriarchal, exact parameters unknown. Their diplomatic status with the Compact was listed as no formal contact. The child looked at me. I looked at the child. She said something in a language I didn't know. It sounded like water over smooth stone, all soft consonants and rising tones. Her citrine eyes were wide. Not afraid, I thought. Surprised. The way you're surprised when you drop something and it doesn't break the way you expected. I crouched down slowly to reduce my height. "Hello," I said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She cocked her head at me. The motion was very precise, not the vague head tilt of confusion, but the deliberate head tilt of someone filing information in a specific mental cabinet. Then she held out the pinecone. I took it. It was warm from her hands, heavy for its size, denser than the pinecones I knew, scaled in dark purple rather than brown. I turned it over in my fingers and then I tossed it up and caught it, mirroring what she'd been doing. She made a sound, not the same satisfied sound as before. This was different, brighter. It was the sound of finding something funnier than expected. She laughed. That was the laugh I'd heard from outside the tree line. In the enclosed space of the clearing, it was clear and sharp, like a bell in a tiled room. And then she reached out with both small hands and took the pinecone back from me, and she threw it up higher than I'd thrown it. And when she caught it, she made the satisfied sound again, and looked at me with her citrine eyes as if checking whether I had understood the point she was making. I had not understood the point she was making, but I understood that she was making one. I sat down on the moss. Not all the way down, I kept my weight forward, legs crossed, in a position from which I could stand quickly if I needed to. But I sat, and the small Velhari child apparently decided this was acceptable, because she settled herself more comfortably into her own cross-legged position and resumed her private pinecone work. We sat together for perhaps 20 minutes. During that time, I did not make any sudden movements. I kept my voice when I used it low and calm. I said ordinary things, named my name, said I was lost, not true, but not a useful thing to explain, said she was doing very well with the pinecone. She watched me when I spoke with the same precise attention as before. She didn't understand me, and I didn't understand her, but there was something else happening that didn't require understanding in the word-meaning sense of understanding. She stopped me from leaving. Not physically, she didn't grab at me or make sounds of protest. But when I made a move to stand, she made a specific gesture. One hand extended, palm out, all 4 fingers splayed and then slowly lowered. It was unmistakably a gesture, and it unmistakably meant, not yet. I sat back down. It was on the 3rd time I tried to stand that I heard the other sound. This one was not laughter. This was the specific, weight-forward sound of large bodies moving through undergrowth with deliberate, controlled velocity. More than one body, coming from the north. The child made a different sound now, not afraid, I thought again, but alert. She was on her feet before I had fully processed what I was hearing, and she was pressed against my left side in a motion so natural and so immediate that I didn't register it as strange until a full second after it happened. She was simply there, against my left side, with one small hand gripping the fabric at my hip. 3 orcs came through the tree line into the clearing. I knew what orcs were, obviously. I'd seen them at trading posts, and once at a diplomatic function I'd been assigned to guard. They are large in the way that natural things are large, not the brutish, clumsy large of the popular illustrations in the Compact's frontier almanacs, but the efficient, deliberate large of a draft horse or a mature bear. These 3 were armed. Short recurve bows slung across broad backs, hand axes at their belts. They wore the specific pattern of dark leather and layered cloth I'd seen at their settlement, which meant they were from that settlement, which meant they'd come south, into the black. They stopped when they saw me. The largest of them, a female, I thought, though the distinction wasn't always clear at this range, said something in Orcish. I understood 3 words of Orcish. Those words were hello, stop, and the specific grunt that meant the trading post was closed for the season. This was not a conversation I could navigate with those 3 words. The child at my side made the same sound she'd made earlier, the one I'd been cataloging as alert. But she hadn't moved. She was still pressed against me, hands still at my hip. I raised both hands, palms forward slowly. Then I pointed at my chest. Davin, I said. My name is Davin Kress. I'm a surveyor. I'm not armed. This was not entirely true. I had the short blade at my belt. I mean, I'm not looking for a fight. I was doing survey work on the perimeter and I paused. I heard her laughing. The 3 orcs looked at each other. Then the largest one looked at the child. A long look, the kind that carries information in its duration rather than in any specific expression. Then back at me. She spoke again, this time slower, as if simplifying. I still didn't understand, but the child did. She spoke, her water-over-stone language flowing quickly, and whatever she said changed the posture of all three orcs in the same instant, a slight settling, a decrease in the specific held quality that bodies have when they are ready to move fast in a dangerous direction. The largest orc crouched down, and the child left my side and went to her, and the orc wrapped both large arms around the small creature with a tenderness so complete and so genuine that it reorganized everything I had been feeling since stepping into this clearing. This was not a military contact. This was a grandmother. This was an aunt. This was something family-shaped regardless of what word applied. They spoke to each other. The child was animated, gesturing, clearly narrating. At one point she mimed tossing something in the air and catching it, and the large orc made a sound that even across the language barrier was unmistakably the sound of an adult, tolerating an enthusiastic child's account of something the adult has assessed as low risk, but is choosing not to dismiss. Then the orc looked at me again. Whatever the child had said, it was enough. The orc stood and she spoke to me in Orcish slowly, and I caught one word I knew, the word for hello. I said it back. She almost smiled. Then she turned and said something to the other two orcs, and they looked at each other with expressions I couldn't read. And then she beckoned. The gesture was universal, it turns out, at least in this part of the world, and she walked north into the trees and I followed. The orcish settlement was not what I had expected. I want to be careful about this, because I have since thought hard about what I was expecting, and I don't have a flattering answer. The Compact's intelligence files described orcish settlements as fortified encampments with military character, and I had absorbed that description the way you absorb descriptions from official documents, not as a conscious belief, but as a background assumption that shapes what you see before you see it. What I saw was a village. The specific texture of a village that has been in one place long enough to have developed opinions about itself. The paths worn smooth between the structures, the central fire with its ring of carefully placed stones, the smaller fires at the edges where specific smells said specific things were being cooked or cured or worked. The structures themselves were built into and around the existing trees, not clumsily bolted on but integrated, the way a craftsman works with the material's nature rather than against it. Platforms at different heights connected by rope bridges and wooden stairways. Ground-level buildings with low, broad doors, the specific proportion of doors built for people who are wide through the shoulder. There were children. A number of children, orcish children, who stopped what they were doing to look at me with the wide-eyed attention of children encountering something new. The Velhari child, she had ridden most of the way on the large orc's shoulder, made a sound when she saw them, and two of the orcish children moved toward her immediately, and within 30 seconds all three of them were on the ground doing something competitive with small stones. The large orc led me to a building near the central fire. Inside, a long table, low benches, the smell of something being kept warm on a clay cookstove. 3 other orcs were already inside. They stood when we entered, which I took as a sign of the senior orc's status rather than as a response to my arrival. She spoke to them. They sat again. One of them, younger, with the kind of carefully maintained leather collar I'd learned to associate with a communication or interpreter function at diplomatic events, turned to me and said, in slow, carefully accented compact common, "She asks why you were in the Black Forest." I had been thinking about this question since the moment I heard the large orc speaking. I had prepared several answers ranging from the defensive to the bureaucratic. The answer that came out of my mouth when the moment arrived was the honest one. "I heard a child laughing," I said, "and I wanted to know what she'd found that was worth laughing about." The interpreter translated. The large orc's expression changed. Not dramatically. The facial expressions of orcs are not less expressive than human ones, I would learn, but they are differently located, more concentrated in the area around the eyes than around the mouth. But something shifted. She spoke. "She says," the interpreter translated, "that the child is the daughter of her daughter, that the child goes to the Black Forest when she is not supposed to, that no one goes to the Black Forest. She asks, "Were you afraid in the Black Forest?" "Yes," I said, "on the way in, less afraid when I found the child." Translation: a longer response from the large orc. She says, "The child is not afraid of the Black Forest. We do not understand why. We have told her the forest is dangerous," she says. "Perhaps she knows something we do not know." A pause. She asks, "What did you and the child do in the clearing?" "We sat," I said. "We passed a pinecone back and forth. I think she was making a point about catching things cleanly, but I may have missed the point." The interpreter looked at me for a moment, then translated. The large orc made a sound. All three of the other orcs in the room made similar sounds. I realized they were laughing. Not unkindly, there was no sharp edge to it. The same quality as the child's laughter, actually. The sound of something genuinely found funny. The large orc spoke again. She says, "The child makes the same point to everyone. No one understands the point." She says, "Perhaps the point is that there is no point, and the child is waiting to see how long it takes each person to relax." I thought about this. "Is that what the child is doing?" I said. The interpreter shrugged, which I had not expected, an entirely human gesture. "We have not been able to ask her," he said. "She does not explain herself." That night they fed me. The food was unfamiliar. A thick grain porridge with a root vegetable I didn't recognize, heavily spiced, accompanied by a fermented drink in a clay cup that tasted like very serious apple cider, and landed in my chest with the same effect. The child sat near me at the communal meal, not speaking to me, but occasionally sliding small items in my direction across the table. A piece of dried fruit, a small carved wooden shape I couldn't identify, once a smooth stone that she placed in front of me with the expression of someone delivering something important. I kept the stone, I still have it. After the meal, the large orc, whose name I had learned through the interpreter, was Graxa, which did not translate directly but meant something like the one who came back, sat with me by the central fire, and we talked through the interpreter for 2 hours. She asked about the compact. I told her the truth, a trading alliance that had become a government without particularly intending to, run by merchants who had discovered that controlling roads was more profitable than using them. She asked what I did for the compact. I told her I surveyed the perimeter of things. She asked which perimeter. I told her, today, the Black Forest's outer edge. She asked what I had found. I said the outer trees lean outward. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that the interpreter translated as, "Yes, we have noticed that too." I asked what it meant. She said she didn't know. She said the forest was old enough that some of what it did no longer had reasons humans or orcs could locate. She said this in a way that was not superstitious. It was the tone of someone describing a fact about a complicated system rather than invoking a mystery for its own sake. I recognized the tone. It was the tone of a competent person describing the limits of their competence. I asked about the Vilhari child. She told me, through the interpreter, that the child had been found 18 months ago at the edge of the Black Forest, which was how the settlement had learned the forest could be entered and exited by someone small enough and unconcerned enough. The child had not spoken at first. Then she had spoken, and they had learned she was Velhari, and they had sent a message north along the old paths to the Velhari territory, and the Velhari had replied eventually with a message that said, "We know. She is there by choice. She chose the forest. We do not understand why she chose the forest. We do not take from those who choose." That last phrase landed in the room with its own weight. The interpreter said it carefully. We do not take from those who choose. I thought about that for a long time. Does she go back, I asked, to the Velhari territory? Sometimes, the interpreter said, translating Grax's answer. She comes, she goes, we do not track her. We feed her when she is here and we watch for her at the forest's edge. We do not ask what she does inside the forest. We think a pause while he processed something from Graxa that required more care. We think she does not need us to ask. The child was asleep by the time this conversation concluded, curled in a nest of woven blankets near the cook stove, with two orcish children nested against her like dogs who have decided where the warmest spot is. She had one small scaled hand visible above the blanket, fingers slightly curled, and there was something about the completeness of her sleep, the total trust of it, that I found I couldn't look at for too long at a time. I slept in the building they gave me, a small annex off the main structure, clean, with a platform bed and a covering of heavy woven cloth. I slept better than I had in 2 nights of camp sleeping, which surprised me. I was 26 miles from my assigned perimeter and technically guests of a settlement I had no authorization to contact. I should have been calculating the least damaging way to report this to the compact. Instead, I slept. In the morning, the child was waiting outside my door. She had the pinecone. When I appeared, she held it out, and when I took it, she made the sound she'd made the day before, the satisfied sound, the one that meant something had gone as expected. I tossed it up and caught it. She made the brighter sound, the amused one. I stayed 3 more days. This is the part of the account that I find hardest to write, not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't. The compact's intelligence files on the Orcish settlements contain a great deal of material about defensive fortifications and military readiness, and the theoretical behavior of Orcish warriors in conflict scenarios. They contain almost nothing about what it is like to have breakfast with an Orcish family, the specific, unhurried quality of it, the way food is passed without asking, the way children drift in and out of conversations without anyone noting the drift, the way the central fire is maintained by whoever is nearest with the same automatic care as keeping a door closed against cold. I helped with some work on the 2nd day. There was a section of one of the elevated platforms that needed the planking replaced, and I am reasonably good with a hammer, and Graxa watched me work with the specific expression of someone assessing competence without wanting to ask about it directly. I worked with a younger male orc named something I couldn't pronounce, but that approximately rendered as Stonefoot. He was 20 or so, serious, precise. We communicated entirely in gesture and expression and the occasional drawn diagram in the dirt. We replaced 12 planks. When we were done, Stonefoot made a gesture with his right hand, a single flat motion, palm down, that I learned later was the Orcish expression for work done well. I made it back. He made the sound that was laughter in a lower register. The child came and went through all of it. She was into the black forest and out again at intervals I couldn't predict. She always came back with something, a scale pattern rubbing on a piece of bark, a cluster of deep-colored berries she distributed at the communal meal, once a single long feather that she presented to Graxa with ceremony that was entirely solemn, and then looked at me to see if I had observed the ceremony's appropriateness. I had. The feather was from something large. I didn't ask. On the 3rd day, the interpreter came to me with a question from Graxa. He was more relaxed now. Our conversations, which had started with the careful formality of official translation, having moved into something more like one person telling another person what someone had said. The distinction matters. He said, Graxa wants to know if the compact is going to send more people. I thought about my orders, the perimeter survey, the assignment that had been designed to be too dangerous for me to return from. Probably not immediately, I said. The map I was sent to make won't tell them much that changes their plan. He translated. Graxa spoke. She says the plan is to build a road, the interpreter said, along the eastern ridge. Our sources tell us this. The road would go through the 2-mile buffer zone. I looked at him. That would violate the armistice. Yes. Does she know that I can't, that I'm a surveyor, not a diplomat? I can't speak for the compact. Translation, response. She says she knows. She is not asking you to speak for the compact. She is asking you to speak for yourself. She asks, what will you do with the map you have made? I thought about this for a long time, long enough that the interpreter didn't prompt me, which I took as evidence that he understood the question required the time. What I would do with the map. I had a map of the outer edge of the Black Forest. I had measurements, notes, compass bearings. I had a perfectly adequate document for the compact's cartographers. What I also had, sitting in my surveying sketchbook alongside the tree-line measurements, were notes. The notes I had made during 3 days of a different kind of observation. The outer trees lean outward. The settlement infrastructure integrates rather than imposes. The elevated platforms are designed to be visible from the forest edge at dawn, which is when the Velhari child is most often seen returning. The central fire is never allowed to go cold. There is a child who goes into the most feared place in the Northern Territories and comes back laughing. I'll write an accurate map, I said, and I'll write an accurate report. The map will show what I found at the perimeter. The report will say what I found when I went past it. The interpreter translated. Graxa was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke and the interpreter said, she says, and if the report says something that the compact does not want said, then they'll probably demote me again, I said. There's not much left to take. The interpreter translated. Graxa made the laughter sound. Then she said something brief, and the interpreter's expression shifted. She says, you are not as lost as you think you are. I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't try to make one. I left the next morning. Graxa and 2 others walked me to the eastern ridgeline, not all the way to the compact's buffer zone, but far enough that the path was clear. Stonefoot came too, though no one had asked him to. The child came. At the point where Graxa stopped, a flat stone at the crest of a low hill, the kind of natural marker that has probably been used as a boundary for as long as people have needed boundaries. I turned, and did not know how to make a departure in a language I didn't have. I had learned perhaps 15 words of Orcish in 3 days. None of them were the right ones for this. The child solved it. She walked up to me and put the pinecone in my hand. Then she made the tossing motion, the catching motion, the satisfied sound. Then she pointed at me and made the same sounds in sequence, as if she were narrating what I was supposed to do. I tossed the pinecone up. I caught it. She made the bright laugh, the amused one, not the satisfied one, which suggested I had again missed a point she was making. But she also made underneath it the satisfied sound, both, at once. I kept the pinecone too. The report I wrote on my return to the compact's administrative center at Essaville was 47 pages long, which was 45 pages longer than any perimeter survey report in the compact's recent history. I included the map. I included precise measurements. I included my encounter with the Orcish settlement, which was technically outside my mission parameters, but which I reported with the same detail I had applied to the tree-line data. I included the information about the road. I included the child, not as an intelligence asset, not as a diplomatic contact. I included her the way you include something that changes what else you know, as a fact that reframes the other facts. 3 people read that report. One of them was the intelligence officer who had assigned me the survey, who called me into his office and told me that I had exceeded my parameters in a way that was going to require a disciplinary review. One was a senior cartographer named Aldi's who found me 2 days later and told me the tree line measurements were the most detailed he'd seen, and could I come and look at something on the large map. The third was a woman named Counselor Havert who I had never met, who sent me a written note that said simply, "I want to talk to you before anyone else talks to you." I went to see Counselor Havert. She was older than I expected, with the specific weathered quality of someone who had spent real time outdoors before she spent time in offices. She had the report open on her desk. "The road," she said without preamble. "Yes," I said. "You confirmed it through Orcish sources." "I confirmed it through one Orcish source, who had confirmed it through her sources. The chain is not short. But it's real. I believe it's real. She looked at me for a moment. The intelligence officer is going to recommend your formal dismissal. Yes. For exceeding your parameters. Yes. You entered the Black Forest. Yes. You made contact with the Orcish settlement. I was invited, I said. I didn't go looking for them. I went into the forest because I heard a child laughing. Havert looked at the report again. At a specific page. I knew which page. I had written that section carefully, because I had known it would be the thing that either made someone believe the rest or give them a reason not to. The Vilhari child, she said. Yes. She's been living in the Black Forest. With the Orcish settlement as a kind of home base, yes. She goes into the forest and comes back. They feed her. They don't ask her questions she can't answer. And Havert stopped, looked at the page. You write that she's not afraid, you write this twice. Because it seemed important twice, I said. The first time for its own sake. The second time because the Orcs, because Graxa, the settlement's matriarch, had clearly thought about it. What it meant that the child went in and came out unharmed. That the child laughed in there. Havert set the report down. She folded her hands on top of it. The compact's position, she said carefully, is that the Black Forest is uninhabitable and inaccessible, and therefore falls outside the terms of the armistice. I know. If it is neither uninhabitable nor inaccessible, then it falls inside the terms, I said. And the road proposed for the eastern ridge goes through a buffer zone that borders territory that now has a documented population, and a documented relationship with the adjacent Orcish settlement, and a documented pattern of use by a Vilhari minor, who is there by her own volition and the tacit agreement of her people. Silence. That's a complicated document, Havert said. 47 pages, I said. She almost smiled. It was the same almost smile quality as Grax's, actually. The expression held mostly in the area around the eyes. The road proposal is from Merchant Governor Tellen's office, she said. He has significant support on the Compact's council. I know. Your report contradicts his territorial assessment. My report describes what I found. Your report, Havert said, could stop the road if the right people read it before the wrong people bury it. I looked at her. Is that what you're telling me? I'm not telling you anything, she said. I'm a counselor asking a surveyor about a survey. She paused. You'll be called before the disciplinary panel in 4 days. The intelligence officer's report will recommend dismissal. If the disciplinary panel dismisses you before your report has been formally entered into the council record, the report can be treated as unsubstantiated personal observation rather than official survey data. And if it's entered into the record before the panel convenes, then it's council business, she said, and council business has its own timeline. I understood. How long does it take to formally enter a survey report into the council record? 3 days, Havert said, ordinarily for a straightforward report. She looked at the 47 pages on her desk. This one may take 2. She entered the report the next morning. The disciplinary panel met on the 4th day, as scheduled, and I was indeed dismissed from the Compact Survey Corps, formally, with a written citation for parameter violation and unauthorized contact with a non-aligned settlement. The intelligence officer shook my hand afterward with the specific satisfaction of someone who believes they have resolved a problem. He was not wrong, technically. What he had not known, when he scheduled the disciplinary panel for the 4th day, was that the council's territorial subcommittee had convened that morning for an emergency session regarding what was being described in the summary document as significant new information about the eastern buffer zone. The merchant governor's road proposal was tabled pending review. The tabling was scheduled to last 90 days. 90 days is a long time in compact politics. Things that are tabled for 90 days have a way of remaining tabled. People who benefit from roads through buffer zones find other roads. I learned this from Aldi's the cartographer, who found me on the day of my dismissal as I was clearing my desk. He told me what had happened in the council session. Then he asked if I would be willing to consult, on a freelance basis, on a revised Eastern territorial map. He offered a fee that was approximately what I had made in 6 months as a compact employee. I said yes. I went back to the Black Forest 2 months later. Not for the compact, not for Aldi's map. I'd finished that work in the first month. I went back because I had a pinecone in my pack and a smooth stone in my pocket, and a point I was still trying to understand. Graxa met me at the edge of the settlement as if she had been told to expect me, which perhaps she had. The paths between here and the eastern ridge carried information faster than I understood. Stonefoot was there, and he made the flat palm gesture that meant work done well, and I made it back. The interpreter was there, and we shook hands in the compact way, which he had learned at some point in the previous 2 months, and then he made the orcish gesture that apparently meant the same thing, and I tried to make it back, and he made the laughter sound. The child came out of the Black Forest that afternoon, as she apparently often did in the afternoon. She had something in her hands, a small animal, I thought at first, and then I saw it was a cluster of stones arranged in a specific pattern, the way you might arrange stones if you were illustrating a point, and the point required spatial representation. She set the cluster of stones down in front of me when she found me at the communal fire, and she looked at me with her citrine eyes, and she made the gesture. Palm out, fingers raised, slowly lowered. Not yet. I put the pinecone down next to the stones. She looked at it. She looked at me. She picked it up and tossed it once, caught it, made the satisfied sound. Then she set it down in a specific position relative to the stones, a specific, deliberate position. I looked at the arrangement. Stones and pinecone, organized in a pattern I couldn't read but which was clearly organized rather than random. I thought about what Graxa had said through the interpreter 2 months ago. Perhaps she knows something we do not know. I thought about sitting in a clearing in the most feared forest in the Northern Territories, passing a pinecone back and forth with a small child, not understanding the point. I thought about what happens when you stop trying to understand the point and start trying to understand the person making it. The child was watching me think. When I looked up, she made a new sound, not the laugh, not the satisfied sound, something quieter. Something that had the specific quality of patience that is not the same as waiting, but is instead the quality of someone who has been somewhere long enough to know that arriving is not the same as getting there. I stayed 6 days that time. I learned more Orcish. I taught the interpreter 3 compact words he'd never encountered, which he received with the same careful filing in a cabinet motion as the child had used on me the first day. I helped Stonefoot with a second platform repair, and then with a drainage problem near the eastern building that had been causing the floor to absorb moisture. We solved it with a channel and a simple deflecting stone, which is the kind of solution that seems obvious once you're looking at it and doesn't exist until someone sits down in the wet room and decides to figure it out. Graxa sat with me one evening and we talked for a long time through the interpreter about what the forest was, not what it meant, not what its danger was, what it was made of, what kinds of trees grew in it, what the subsonic sounds might be, the ground-felt ones, the tidal ones. She had theories. They were not the theories of someone who was afraid of the forest. They were the theories of someone who had lived next to a complicated thing for a long time and had developed a working relationship with its complexity. She told me the child had brought something out of the forest 3 months ago that none of them had seen before. A shell, or something like a shell, the dried casing of something organic, roughly circular, the size of a dinner plate, covered in a regular geometric pattern. Graxa brought it out and showed me. It was beautiful in the way that natural mathematical objects are beautiful. The pattern was not imposed on the object. It was the object. Whatever had made it this way, by the same logic that snowflakes are hexagonal. "Does anyone know what it is?" I asked. The interpreter asked Graxa. She answered. "No," he said. "The child says it is a gift. She does not say from whom." I turned the shell over in my hands, dense, smooth on the inside. "I'd like to sketch it," I said, "for all these records." "She says yes," the interpreter said before he translated. Graxa had apparently read the question before it was asked. I sketched it carefully. I have the sketch. The shell is at the Orcish settlement still, as far as I know. Graxa has it on the mantelpiece of the main building, next to the central fire, in the same position you'd put something that means something. The Territorial Subcommittee's 90-day review concluded with a formal revision of the Eastern Buffer Zone boundaries. The revision incorporated the survey data from my report, attributed to the Compact's Eastern Survey Corps, not to me specifically, which was fine. The road proposal from Merchant Governor Tellen's office was resubmitted with an adjusted route that went significantly further north, away from the buffer zone, adding 11 miles to the proposed road. The Merchant Governor was apparently unhappy about this. Aldi's told me the Merchant Governor had used language at the council session that the minutes recorded only as intemperance, which was the Compact's elegant word for shouting. The council's decision was not celebrated anywhere I could see. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about how institutions work. The right outcome often happens quietly, without spectacle, tucked inside a procedural revision that most people never read. A road was rerouted. 11 miles of additional engineering cost redistributed through a merchant governor's budget. The trees at the buffer zone continued to lean outward. The forest continued to breathe. Aldi's commissioned me for 3 more surveys in the following year. None of them were near the eastern ridge. He had that map complete and accurate, and he is not a man who pays twice for the same information. The work took me north, to the foothills passes, and then west, to the tidal river deltas where the Compact wanted to understand seasonal flooding patterns. It was good work. Systematic, physical, with the specific satisfaction of finding the true measurement of a thing that has been estimated wrongly for years. But I thought about the forest often. Not obsessively. I am not built for obsession, I think. More the way you think about a conversation that you know isn't finished even though it ended politely, and you left on good terms. The kind of conversation that continues in the back of the mind, adding context as new things are learned, and then turning the new things over to see whether they change the shape of what was already there. I thought about what Graxa had said. The child is not afraid of the Black Forest. We do not understand why. I thought about the way the large orc had held the child when they were reunited in the clearing, the completeness of that gesture. I thought about how the interpreter had shrugged, that entirely human shrug, and how strange it was to see a gesture travel across whatever distance separated the human vocabulary of gestures from the orcish one and arrive intact, meaning the same thing. The shrug that means, I have stopped being surprised by this. There is a word in Orcish. I learned it in my 4th visit, from Graxa directly, speaking slowly and watching to see whether I was catching the meaning, that has no direct Compact equivalent. The interpreter tried 3 different translations before landing on the one that satisfied him least but was closest. Grakful. It means something like the calm that comes from having been more afraid of a thing than the thing deserved. Not relief exactly. Relief implies the danger has passed, and Grakful doesn't require that. It implies instead that the relationship between the person and the thing has been correctly calibrated. You were afraid. You learned. You are now exactly as afraid as the situation warrants, which is to say, somewhat but functionally, ready for breakfast, capable of work. The child operated in permanent Grakful. It was, the Orcish adults had collectively decided, either a gift or a developmental quirk or evidence of something about the forest that they hadn't been close enough to measure. Possibly all three. On my fifth visit, I brought a proper linguistic reference. The Compact's published primer on Velhari language, which had been compiled 40 years ago from second-hand sources and was accordingly full of errors, but was better than nothing. The child found it in my pack the first evening, opened it, turned several pages with her small scaled hands, and then made a sound that was entirely new to me. A low, steady note like the first tone of a laugh that doesn't know yet whether it's going to be funny or exasperated. She pointed at a word in the primer. Then she said it aloud. Then she shook her head, a gesture she had clearly learned from the orcs around her, who used it as a no. I looked at the word. I looked at the transcription of its pronunciation. "Is this wrong?" I asked. She made the shaking head gesture again, more emphatically. "Is it really wrong?" She thought about this, tilting her head. Then she held up one hand and waggled it, the gesture she had invented for almost, or close but not exactly, and said the word again, this time differently, with a different emphasis on the second syllable that changed its sound completely and presumably changed its meaning. I wrote the correction in the margin. She watched me do it. When I was done, she made the satisfied sound. Over the next 2 evenings, she went through 16 pages of the primer. She corrected 11 entries, confirmed 6, and on 3 made the waggling hand gesture, which I took to mean the primer had captured something real but imprecise. It was the most systematic thing I had ever seen her do. She was usually more intuitive, more improvisational, responding to what was in front of her rather than working through a structure. But the primer seemed to activate something different. She cared about the accuracy of the record. She cared, I thought, whether the thing would be correctly understood by someone who wasn't there to ask. I am no longer employed by the Compact in any formal capacity. I consult for Aldi's on cartographic work, which pays adequately. I have learned enough Orcish to hold a simple conversation without an interpreter, which is not enough to say what I need to say to Graxa when I visit, but is enough to say more than hello and stop. The child is still at the settlement, more or less. She goes into the Black Forest and comes back. Last month she came back with something new. A single scale, translucent, larger than her handspan, that caught light the way glass catches light but was clearly organic. She put it on the central fire, and it burned blue for 40 seconds and then went out. And the Orcish children screamed in delight, and the Orcish adults made various sounds ranging from startled to annoyed to, in Grax's case, the specific resigned calm of someone who has agreed to the fact that extraordinary things are going to happen in their home. I have been thinking since that evening about what the forest is. Not in the way that soldiers or merchants or council members think about it, as a territory to be assessed or avoided or eventually incorporated into some framework of use and regulation. I mean what it is in the way that a thing is itself, what its internal logic is, what it's doing when no one is measuring it. The Compact's intelligence files contain one theory, which is that the Black Forest is simply a region of unusually dense and old-growth woodland that generates the kind of subsonic resonance associated with certain high-pressure root systems. The dwarves believe it is the echo of an old catastrophe, something geological that happened before the current arrangement of the world. The Orcs, or at least Graxa speaking for the Orcs, believe it is alive in a way that is not the same as a tree being alive or an animal being alive. Alive in the way that a relationship between two things can be alive, can have its own logic and its own direction even though neither thing alone is the relationship itself. I don't know which of these is true. I suspect they are all partial truths about different aspects of the same complicated system. The way that the Compact's map of the Eastern Ridge and Graxa's knowledge of the Eastern Ridge and the child's relationship with the Eastern Ridge are all true and all different and all necessary to understand the full thing. What I know is that the child goes in and comes back. What I know is that she comes back with things that none of us can name but that feel when you hold them, like pieces of a vocabulary you haven't yet learned. What I know is that she laughed in there, alone, before she knew that anyone was close enough to hear her, which means the laughter was genuine and not performed, and not a response to anything, except whatever she had found in the dark that was worth laughing at. There is a passage in the Compact's founding charter, the original document, not the revised edition, which is drier and more administrative, that talks about the purpose of survey work. It says, "The purpose of measuring a thing is not to contain it, but to know it well enough to live alongside it without unnecessary fear." This was written by someone named Aldous Carveth, no relation to my current employer but clearly a relative of the same disposition. He meant it about land and flooding, and the practical matters of where to build and where not to build, but I think it applies more broadly. The Black Forest is the thing we learned to fear before we measured it. We measured the outside of it for generations without going in. We noted that the trees leaned outward, and we added this to our list of evidence for the fear, rather than asking what it meant about the trees themselves. We named it in every language in terms of what it might do to us, and we stopped there, because naming something dangerous is easier than staying curious about it. A child went in. She found it worth laughing at. She came out and went back in and came out again, and went back in again, and at some point she stopped being a child who had done a remarkable thing, and became simply a person who lived a certain kind of life, with the forest as one of its territories, and the settlement as another, and the wide terrain between them as a third. The Orcs fed her, and asked no questions. She couldn't answer and watched for her at the forest's edge. A demoted surveyor went in because he heard her laughing. I am not a remarkable person. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I did not go into the Black Forest because I was brave or because I had some particular quality that made me suited for it. I went in because I was curious, and because I had been afraid of enough things that had turned out to be survivable that my calibration was slightly off from the standard compact surveyor setting. I went in because the sound of a child laughing in a place that was supposed to be empty was the most interesting thing I'd heard in 2 days, and I have never been good at walking away from interesting things. What I found was what the forest had always been, which is to say, a forest, old, quiet, alive in whatever way Graxa meant when she said it, full of things I couldn't name, and things the child was slowly naming, and things that burned blue for 40 seconds on a communal fire, and made everyone in the room feel, for a moment, like they were standing at the edge of a vocabulary that didn't have its words yet but was getting ready to. The child looked at me when the flame went out, the citrine eyes, the precise head tilt. I made the tossing motion, the catching motion. She made the satisfied sound. I still don't know what the point is. I think that might be the point. I think the child has been in a place long enough to know that the question of what a thing means is much less interesting than the question of how a thing feels when you sit with it in the dark and are not afraid. I think she laughed in the Black Forest because she found it funny. I think she found it funny because everyone else was afraid of it, and she had gone in and found that the dark breathed the same as anywhere else. Just slower, just older, just more comfortable with what it didn't know. I think the Orcs let her come and go because they understood, without being able to say it, that the child was living the answer to a question they'd been asking wrong. I think I went into the forest because I heard her laughing, and I had run out of good reasons not to. I go back every few months now. The path from the cartographer's office in Essayville to the Orcish settlement runs through 26 miles of increasingly quiet terrain, and I know every section of it now, and I know where the birds stop and where the air changes, and where the outer trees lean outward like they're trying to tell you something about which direction is toward and which direction is away. I always bring the pinecone. The child always makes the point I keep missing. I don't mind missing it. I think the missing is part of what she's teaching. The smooth stone is in my pocket right now as I write this, which is probably not relevant to the report but is true, and I have tried to write only true things. I have been demoted and dismissed, and I have walked into the most feared forest in the Northern Territories and sat in the dark with a child who was not afraid. I have passed a pinecone back and forth until I stopped wondering when it was going to make sense and started simply catching it. I do not think I am as lost as I thought I was. I think I may finally be arriving.